You're listening to Artistic Finance, show 161. On today's show, we discuss labor in theatrical production with the authors of the new book, Theater Work. We discuss how institutions can prioritize workers, retention and training challenges for theaters, minimum wage, living wage, and thriving wage, and holding theaters accountable for their mission statement. The first third of the show, we get to know the authors and talk about why the book was written, which provides context to the discussion. But if you're in the industry and already know why this topic and data is important, skip to the 20-minute mark where we start addressing the topic head on. Without further ado, let's get to the show.
You are listening to Artistic Finance, where we help creatives learn about the business of show business.
Welcome and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Ethan Steimel. We're recording this July 22nd, 2024, and today I welcome lighting designer Natalie Robin and performing arts manager Brídín Clements. I'm recording this from St. Louis. Natalie is in Philadelphia and Brídín is in Portugal. And the latest news today for whoever listens to this in the future is that yesterday Joe Biden dropped out of the US presidential race and Kamala Harris has taken over. So we'll see what happens. Natalie, I mentioned you're a lighting designer. What else should we know about you?
I am a full-time labor organizer. I'm the organizer for IATSE Local USA 829, which represents designers, scenic artists, and coordinators in live performance, television, and film. I'm also an educator. I'm based in Philadelphia, as you said, and I use she, her pronouns.
Fantastic. All right, Brídín, you're a performing arts manager, and what else is your lot in life?
Thank you. I use she, her pronouns as well, and I'm an educator. I currently am based in Abu Dhabi, where I'm the instructor of stage management and project management at New York University, Abu Dhabi. I love working with students and in creative places. And then I also do some visual arts myself. At the moment, I'm in my collaging era, doing a lot of mixed media work.
That's fantastic. All right. So for both of you to get to know you a little bit, what is a live event that you like to experience as an audience member? And I'm going to start with Natalie.
I mean, I'm a sucker for a musical, but I also love concerts and sort of any live performance. I love the experience of sharing the moment with both my fellow audience members and the performers.
I love it. And if you had to pick a musical right now to go see, what would you like to go see?
I'm really spoiled because I'm a Tony voter. So I've seen all the new musicals, but I really want to see Six, which I haven't seen yet.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope that one day you get to see it because I also haven't and I really want to. All right. Brídín, what is the live event that you like to experience as an audience member?
I can't believe Natalie's never seen Six.
I know. It's crazy.
I love everything. I really, really love going to things and I love gathering with people together, but in particular, concerts. I was thinking when I saw this question about coming out of the pandemic and of quarantine, the first concert I went to was Bright Eyes at Forest Hills Stadium, and just the outdoor, the venue that evening, like it felt like one of the most magical evenings I've had in like the last 5 years, but just people together.
Awesome. In the last 5 years, and the last 5 years is coming to Broadway soon. Not a revival. It's never been there before.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Funny.
Yeah, Natalie, you'll have to come back and let us know how it was since you're going for the Tony voting.
Sure.
All right. So now, money question. Are you good or bad with money? Starting with Natalie again.
Oh, I'm bad with money. I was just telling Brie this, which I think a little bit comes from years and years of being a freelance artist who was never making enough. So I was like, oh, I don't have to be good at it because it's impossible. And now I'm still not good at it.
That's amazing. All right. I like to cut people slack because if you're not making a lot of money, it's like you could be good with money and still, I don't know. I think some people think they're bad and it's like, well, some people look like they're good, but they just have more money.
Well, that is certainly possible. Yes.
All right, Brídín, are you good or bad with money?
I think of myself as good with money. But I would say, particularly when we're traveling like we are at the moment, my partner would probably say that I am very micromanagey when it comes to money. Like I think of myself as good with money but every time we're apart for a day, at the end of the day, I will say, how much did this cost? How much did this cost? What do you spend money on? Like a little bit overbearing.
Just right now, as we were starting this, my wife texted and said, okay, I paid half the credit card bill. I need you to pay the other half. So similar, she might be a little micromanaging too. Okay, awesome. So we're here today to discuss theatrical labor, a topic on which you've both recently published a book together titled Theater Work, Reimagining the Labor of Theatrical Production, which means that you know the ins and outs of this topic. So I'm just going to start with what motivated you to collaborate on this book.
Natalie and I have worked together in the past and have known each other for over 10 years. We, just in terms of our collaborative relationship, started working together on American Realness, a contemporary performance festival that we both worked together on from around 2012 through 2016. So that's in terms of our relationship. But the book, both of us have worked in the field in many different ways that clearly fed into this research. And then I chose to study public policy as my master's. My background is stage management and theater management, but rather than pursuing a higher degree in stage management, I really wanted to think about management of other things and how it sort of relates to management of arts organizations. So I was learning about HR and hiring and how you sort of motivate employees in the workplace and how you evaluate people in the workplace. And through that, I kept then finding moments to focus in on theater and on labor in theater. So my first assignment in grad school, I wrote an op-ed that I then published with HowlRound about internship practices in the performing arts, and in particular, the barriers that unpaid and underpaid internship culture creates. And then I did a big research project on gender equity, particularly in design. And I also did a project about performing arts in higher ed and how accessible or inaccessible it is. And all of that sort of led to this place of feeling like each of those topics are really related. Like it felt a little bit like we can't look at internship practices and not look at hiring. We can't look at hiring and not think about pay equity. We can't think about pay equity and everything just is so connected. So it was some of that sparked it. And the other thing that sparked it was in studying this field, and particularly the production workers, seeing how little there is written in sort of academia or in research formats that people in the world respect. So just continuing to find that there are now a few studies out there, but there's really very little out there there's stuff about playwrights, there's stuff about who's on stage, there's things about some people in the field, but there isn't a lot about the people who are working in the technical positions and design positions. So that was sort of like the initial spark. And then we started talking about the book project. Do you want to take it over, Natalie?
Sure. Yeah. So I come to this work both as a lighting designer, I've experienced as a production manager and a producer, but then also through the lens of being an educator for about 15 years, something like that. And through my work as a labor organizer, right? So like thinking about working with folks who are on the verge of entering this field and working with folks who have been doing this for some amount of a career and seeing the ways in which the issues perpetuate themselves. A lot of what we talk about in the book is not new information to folks working in the field, certainly to production workers. But our goal, in part, in writing a book was to give it the legitimacy that people who care about books will pay attention to something that's written in a book, which is why we chose to write a book instead of like a bunch of blog posts or some other format.
Okay, that's fantastic. And also, Bree, those two papers you mentioned that you published, those sound very interesting. How recent were those?
The internship one was the fall before COVID began. And then the gender equity piece, they're both published online. That's in the Wagner Review, which is an online journal. was probably like 2021, but that was from existing research that I didn't conduct.
Okay, fantastic. Well, they sound, I sort of want to read them. So I will find them. I'll put links to them in the show notes for this.
I think they're linked on our website, just so you.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Work is done. And the website is?
productionlaborbook.com.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, that sounds great. And so you've sort of answered my next question about why you did this, but I'm just curious, was there sort of an aha moment that you both had that was like, oh, now we should work together?
I mean, there wasn't an aha moment for me about the research. Like, it's really an accumulation of seeing these patterns over the course of a 25-year long career. I mean, Bree emailed me and was like, do you want to write a book? And I think there's a little bit about like, we're a good match collaboratively. Bree did and is excited about the research, the nitty-gritty of the research. And I have always had a sort of writing practice. I wrote for a bunch of magazines. And so that pairs well in terms of finding ways to articulate this work. I'm very thankful that Bree wanted to read all of the studies that we reference, because I do not want to read them. I did read them, but Bree is able to like dig into them in a way that I think is incredible. It's not an aha moment, but it's sort of a like why we did it together in some ways.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think two different threads. One, in terms of our collaboration, I think we're really fortunate to have this collaboration, and it is difficult. And we sort of say to ourselves lately that we could do another conversation about having this type of collaborative relationship and doing this type of project, particularly from different sides of the world. But I think it's worth noting that we both had a lot of privilege when we began this. We were both working in educational institutes. I continue to be, where we've had various privileges, including funding and time off to do the book project. So part of being able to take this on was being in a type of career that values this type of work and sort of recognizes this type of work as important toward the jobs that pay us. But then to your question, also in terms of any like aha moment, part of why I feel it's always important to reference studying public administration is that it was really for me in that program, I was with people who are thinking about managing all types of organizations. Every time I would describe how the workplace operates in theater, people would be shocked. And it's the kind of things that any person, like you as a designer, any person we talk to would just be like, of course I don't interview for jobs. Like, of course I don't get maternity leave, all of these kinds of things. And it was really being in conversation with people from other fields that I think pushed me into wanting to research it in this way.
Well, I'm so appreciative that you have done this and that you're putting sort of statistics out there. Through the years, I just don't mention what I do. Like, I don't want to talk about it because as soon, in the first 1 minute, I feel judged or appalled or like, why are you why? That's ridiculous. That's so abnormal. So I just sort of like, don't bring it up. So I appreciate you guys shedding the light on this and also doing the work, because I know when I started artistic finance in 2020, I was like, okay, let's find some statistics on the labor or the pay or all this. And I'm not going to say hard to find. It's impossible to find. So there is a little bit of it, but even the stuff that does exist is like not specific or doesn't answer the questions I want. And so I'm very appreciative that you are doing this. And speaking of that, of how difficult it is, what has been the biggest challenge in both gathering the information, but also presenting it, so that readers or people can decipher it?
So we referenced existing studies, and then we did a survey. We did a national worker survey, which had a really great response. We got 1,037 worker responses, which is like a great sample set for a survey like this. We also did an employer survey, which we sent to several hundred theaters, producing organizations, general managers, shops, like scene shops. And we got an incredibly small sample set of responses. That made it really hard. We just don't have enough data to generate real statistics. We can talk about, and we do in the book reference sort of qualitative responses from those employers, but it's incredibly hard to say like what is happening from an employer perspective. And so that led to some it's just complicated. It made some of the data feel more anecdotal, and we knowingly asked a lot of hard questions that we knew they might not want to tell us, but it was just challenging to get such a small sample set in response.
Yeah, I can imagine, because I just wrapped up a summer stock season that was connected to a university. There's really only like 3 people that understand the pay and the offers going out in the contracts, maybe 4 people: the production manager, the producer who's the head of the department, the clerk who does all the contracts, and then the marketing department who deals with the unions and stuff like that. So I imagine if you sent this sample out to an organization like that, it's like really you need one of those 4 people to take a bunch of time, and they're so busy, even not wanting to share information or not wanting to disclose it could definitely be challenging on that set.
Well, just to say that I think in a way this ended up shaping the sort of narrative of the book. We knew it would be worker focused, but partially because of the data that we ended up with, that might have led it to be more worker focused, because that's then the data that we really have. And to your question about the biggest challenge, I think in gathering, it was definitely the employer responses, and things kept changing. Like every day we were getting massive news, right, of theaters shutting down or calling off their seasons, or another survey coming out, about these topics and things like that. So I think that was the other challenge. I think is just important in how we frame our research, that we really think of it as a snapshot, right? So even now, it's July. We submitted the book a year ago, July, and it was published this spring. So our survey, the worker survey, was 2 Julys ago. So even now it feels outdated and will continue to, but the hope is that it's a useful resource and that this snapshot can continue to be valuable. But I think that was just an interesting challenge, in that these conversations actually sort of blew up as we were writing the book.
Part of that was not just the data changing and new data happening, but also a lot of the book comes from interviews with folks working in the field. A remarkable number of people transitioned out of the jobs they were in when we interviewed them, in some cases of their own choice, in some cases not of their own choice. We tried to keep up with that happening, but in the months between turning in the book September 1st and the book coming out in April, more of those things happened. And so really encouraging people to think about it as a snapshot of what the industry looked like at this moment, sort of over the course of 22 into 23, is the best way of thinking about it.
And I think that's perfect, because post-pandemic, there's been a lot of change, and a lot of it's been painful, but honestly, a lot of it is good, even though it's painful. Even pre-pandemic, in the old days, everything was always evolving, especially with all of us being gig workers, even in permanent, gig positions. Everything is always changing. But I think it's an important snapshot here, because it's post-pandemic, when in theory things have changed. But I bet it reflects a lot that hasn't changed. All right. So now a big question, which I don't know if this is the right question, but you two are the experts here. So what is the current state, this current situation of theater labor?
It's bad. The situation is pretty dire, both I think from a worker standpoint and an employer standpoint. One of the pieces of data that we both come back to, I think, a lot, is in a survey conducted by Production on Deck and Portia McGovern that was published in Stage Directions. 37% of the production workers responded that they were tentative about going back to the field to absolutely not returning. That sort of a third of the workforce has left or did leave following the return to work in 2021, has caused a lot of the things we talk about in the book actually to get worse, like the expectation for the same amount of work to get done by fewer people with less time not being paid enough. Also, we're looking at employers who are received actually a balloon of funding during the pandemic to stay afloat, are now looking at a new economic landscape. The positive part of this, I think, is that we've seen an incredible amount of labor organizing at both, in the not-for-profit world, at both the League of Resident Theaters, the laureate level across the country, and specifically in the off-Broadway sector, which is really exciting. There's nothing, more powerful than a bunch of workers coming together to make their lives better. But it is in contrast to and in simultaneity with an incredibly challenging moment.
Just to emphasize that point that Natalie's making, I feel like we're in this limbo right now where the worker advocacy is happening and people are organizing, and the foundation and like the structure of the American professional theater isn't built in a way that can support people making a living wage or a thriving wage. So it's like right now we're in this moment where workers are fighting for worker rights and theaters are not built in a way to support worker rights.
Ain't that the truth? The recent things that I've seen is Little Shop of Horrors off Broadway transitioning to IATSE or labor or union labor. Titanic also off Broadway show. And then I know Drunk Shakespeare, not for the offstage workers, but I know their performers got switched to equity. But those are recent as of this year. And it is great to see. But on that same vein, just the finances of theater are complex. And I don't know how you have the union and also make money in this landscape. So I can understand the producers struggle, or whoever the production managers are finding all this. I can see that it's very complicated.
If I can offer, there are 3 institutional off-Broadway theaters that have won union recognition this season: the Atlantic, the Public, and the Vineyard, to just name that those workers, hundreds of workers off-Broadway are doing this organizing work. I would also offer that the answer about how you fund it is that you don't pay your executive leadership exponentially more than you pay your workers. We know what the 990s of the institutions say about executive leadership pay. And so that's one answer. And I think the other answer, which we talk about quite a lot in the book, is that there has long been an interest in funding the stuff over the people. One of my favorite sort of anecdotal statistics about this is a set designer colleague of mine talks about how when she designs a Lort show at a Lort D theater, the rate is about $3,500. And she feels fine about designing a set at a small theater where the set budget is $7,500 to make a $3,500 fee. But she makes the same $3,500 fee at a theater where the budget is $75,000. And there's really an untapped conversation, and in fact, a resisted conversation from the theater standpoint about reallocating funding from equipment and materials to labor, which is not to deny that things cost more than they used to, but to say, like, we are creative problem solvers. And so we can do amazing things with less stuff, especially if you pay us more.
There's the theater budgeting, and then also at the sort of benefactor level, foundations and donors could also be choosing to fund operations or labor as opposed to projects.
Ooh, I like that. The idea, or sort of. I mean, I hate that everyone's relying on benefactors, but also that's just how the world works. But to put in their ear, I guess we have to lobby them. I will also throw in my own anecdote because you mentioned Vineyard. So I assisted on a Vineyard back 2015-ish, and I got $900 or $1,000 for my assisting fee, and the rental budget was $15,000 for lighting. And I remember being so bitter. I actually quit theater for 2 years after that because it wasn't just their fault, but it was just like, and I think I was on a Union USA assisting contract, I think. Don't quote me on this, actually. But more of the story is I remember thinking and being so upset, like, we could have used $14,000 of equipment and I could have gotten $2,000, which would have really improved my life and would have minimal impact on the lighting outcome of the show.
And that story is the story that we hear and see over and over again. The impact on the workers of shifting a relatively small amount of money. To use that example of the set designer gives, if she made $7,000, the set budget would still be $72,000. It doesn't matter. And yeah, we really see exactly the example you gave over and over again in our data.
right now, today, I guess 2024, what are the most pressing issues that workers are faced today?
Starting sort of at the early level, an initial issue continues to be the reliance on unpaid and underpaid labor. We haven't figured it out. I think, in the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation about getting rid of internship programs, but there haven't been large scale sustainable solutions to how folks then get the professional training that they need and how large organizations or productions function in a way that doesn't rely on underpaid or unpaid labor. It's a over talked about, but still not yet solved issue that we need to continue stating.
To just in the beginning of someone's career, I mean, even before that, the cost of like the expectation that theater workers have a 4-year degree and often a 4-year BFA, if not also a master's degree, at a time when NYU's cost per year is $108,000. So we're asking people to find $450,000 to fund the training for a career that is not going to have that kind of financial return.
And just really quick on that, Natalie, and that with those degrees, you probably wouldn't get a job. You would still need the work experience.
So the early career education challenge of both classroom education and unpaid and underpaid labor at the training level. But then we're also talking about a field that, though lots of theater is unionized, most of it is not. Like, we have no idea how many workers there are in theatrical production across the country. What we do know is that the IATSE, which represents workers in all aspects of entertainment, has 171,000 workers. Arguably, there are hundreds of thousands of more people doing this work without labor protections, which means working at minimum wage if they're lucky, if not being misclassified as independent contractors and paid in a fee-based way where their hourly rate is likely lower than minimum wage, as yours was when you assisted on that show. I will say that now the off-Broadway 829 contract does protect that. But without safety protections, without health insurance, and without access to a dignified retirement, we talk a lot about the idea of a thriving wage in the book, which is not just enough money to live on, but is enough money to save for the future, whether that's about emergency funding, funding a future education, funding buying a house, funding saving for retirement, or just the ability to go on vacation. And the desperation and the scarcity mentality of the employers puts the workers in a situation where they don't have access to that.
In addition, in terms of the question about the most pressing issues, the scarcity mindset that Natalie just mentioned is a really, and these issues are really sort of foundational and they're really, really deeply embedded into our culture. And another thing that feels really sort of embedded into our operations is just the lack of value of the work. And with that, this idea that people need to sort of pay their dues. We found in our research over and over that some of the people most resistant to the change are the workers themselves, because this is the way it's always been done, because I paid my dues. So you need to work in these crazy hours, unsafe working conditions, all of this, because that's just how it's done and things like that. So I think how many of these challenges are so deeply sort of felt in the culture, in the field, is really, I think, like a under recognized issue.
Yeah. And that's a tough one because it's so, we've all been there. We all understand it. Yeah. And that's just a tough one because, how do you change? You've done it this way for 40 years and now people don't want to do it that way, but you don't know another way. You haven't seen an example of that other way. And so it's coming inevitably, hopefully, because I also work with young people all the time. I guess we all do. I rarely ask them to work harder or extra. Anytime they want to take a break, anytime they don't want to come in, I make it work, and I just sort of modified my design. And sometimes it's frustrating for me, but doing my part, I try to let people have the conditions that they want. but it's hard for me sometimes because I don't get what I want.
I was going to say, and it transfers the responsibility to an individual, which is not actually where the change needs to happen. The ask shouldn't be that you modify your design, which creates more work for you, or end up working harder yourself in order to make the thing happen, right? The changes need to happen on a systemic and institutional level so that everyone, because you're as much of a worker as the folks you're talking about. And so like we need to shift the conversation to how do we support the humans doing the work, all of the work, inside of a system that also values the humans as humans.
And I also love, you mentioned thriving wage. I sort of love that because I always use living wage, and thriving is much better because living wage, I did this in Missouri in an argument to get my fee higher. I went and looked at the living wage in Missouri and it's painfully low. I was like, oh my goodness. Like, yes, technically you can live on that, but it's not much. So the thriving wage I appreciate, because if you go to the charts that are sponsored by the state governments and maybe the federal governments on what that livable wage is, it's like, that's not really livable. We touched on this a little bit with all the mentions of those organizing labor theaters, but has the labor movements, sort of the strikes, the advocacy since the pandemic, has that impacted working conditions for theater workers now?
At least in our research, the strikes have been primarily in the motion picture sector. And so they're sort of outside the scope of our research. I think what we look at more is the impact of worker-led advocacy, which started during what we refer to as the pause, which is the 16 months where there was no live performance.
I think because of the time that we were doing our research, and it still feels like a really important sort of touch point as we think then about what's happened in the years since, we looked a lot at when theater shut down and what happened during that time in terms of workers really having a chance to talk and to think about these issues and maybe explore what their life could look like without theater, or without the less healthy or less enjoyable parts of what we do. And then there were a few sort of key studies that we referenced about this time. So one of the studies that we found that really informed our writing was David McGraw and Meg Friedman. They conducted the Return to the Stage study, which they call a longitudinal study of performing arts workers in the US designed to understand COVID-19 related impacts and to begin documenting a broad future vision for the field. So this was also broader than our scope, but they actually pulled out specifically the theater production workers and did sort of an extra analysis for us to give us access to that data. So they did the study in July 2020, in January 2021, and in July 2021. And in July 2020, 56% of the respondents reported either being unemployed, furloughed, or unable to work. In January 2021, that unemployment was still at 49%. And then in July 2021, it had dropped to 24%. But it really just illustrated how hard hit this field was. So at that point, a lot of other folks had returned to work or were returning to work, and the theater production workers were like the pause was extending. And then through their study and also the Production on Deck study that Natalie mentioned earlier, they also discussed a lot of the mental health effects that it had on workers, emotional impacts. And then to get back to the question, we used a lot of the sort of worker organizing and looked at a lot of the worker dialogue and organizing that happened during that time.
A lot of people are familiar with the We See You White American Theater letter and demands, which is an extensive document created by about 300 BIPOC theater workers, which provided what we think of as guidelines or suggestions, but what a lot of employers took as an quite literal checklist. So I think one of the things that we've seen happen is that there's been a lot of actions taken by employers, and I use employers as an umbrella for both not-for-profit and commercial producers just because it's easier, but to be able to say look, we've made these changes, but it's all well and good to, for example, eliminate the 10 out of 12 tech process. Except that if you expect the same amount of work to happen in less time. That is putting an unreasonable strain on the workers. B, if you extend the tech period in order to make up for the hours you've lost, but you don't pay people more, especially the folks who are paid on a fee, everyone is making less and potentially is able to take less work. C, if you only limit the 10 out of 12 for the performers and not for the designers and technicians, then you're not actually making our days shorter. And we've seen all of those iterations happen, right? It's like, it's easy to make the sort of top level change without iterating the ramifications of that change and really thinking about why this is the ask. There's a lot of excellent worker level advocacy happening. There's organizations like Design Action, which was created during the pause to sort of pair white and BIPOC designers and create new opportunities. There's the 152nd Project, which is a funding model. There's organizations that existed before, like Wingspace or Behind the Scenes, which have increased their advocacy work in different ways. And a lot of these organizations are doing really excellent work that we would love to see be able to scale up, but without buy-in on a national level, not just in funding, but in commitment. It's hard for any single organization to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think buy-in and like systems. Like we don't have the systems for those efforts to scale up at the moment. All of the progressive initiatives in theater operations are quite minuscule in comparison to the professional field. You know, giving a scholarship to 10 students doesn't address the overall issues with access to education. You know, like each of the sort of worker-led initiatives that we look at is like on a very specific scale, what change can folks make? And it doesn't really address the sort of massive systemic issues.
Right. And that goes back a little bit to the individual shouldn't be making the changes, because you mentioned 10 out of 12s getting rid of those. Well, that's great. But the place I was at this summer, they actually are trying to get rid of it, which is great. But it came down to me every single show. It was always, Ethan, you, the lighting designer, can you do this without a 10 out of 12? I am always trying to be cooperative. And I said, yes, I can. And I could. We were outdoors, so half of it was daylight. So it's like, well, those 2 hours don't help me anyway. So yeah. But that goes back to, why am I, the lighting designer, making this decision versus the organization saying we're going to be doing this? Talking about all the employers and the producers, what role do they play in improving this?
A massive role. I mean, just I think to go back to what Natalie was just saying, we had the pause. We had this time where we were able to talk and discuss like all the issues and what could be better. And then so little has actually changed thus far. And the changes that have happened, like your example, like are not yet functional. You know, instead, what we're really seeing is theaters either shutting down or doing layoffs or announcing pauses of seasons. So we clearly, that talk and those ideas have not yet been enacted in a way that's sustainable. But I think the employers have a huge, huge responsibility. In particular, back to what Natalie mentioned earlier about the budgets as a value statement in terms of prioritizing the people potentially over the stuff. And then again, thinking about funding beyond just at the institutional level. So at the moment, that would be, you know, foundations, donors, potentially government support. How those funding decisions and criteria is structured is a major way where institutions could then make changes. So, you know, at the moment, many nonprofits would budget based and making decisions within the institution based on grant requirements. So if the grant requirements are really to do with the audience or the project or the stuff, that would then be the focus. But if foundations or other, you know, grant givers had more criteria to do with pay equity or what sorts of benefits organizations are providing, those could be ways that would then take the responsibility slightly off of just the individual institution.
I think too, somebody asked us this question at a book talk that we gave about like, how can individual audience members or regular theater goers help? On some level, I think the answer is, well, you can't. But actually, like one thing that we talked about is the idea that you can ask theaters to be accountable to their mission statement. One of the things that we are interested in is the dialogue between what a theater says their mission statement is and how the board specifically holds the institution accountable to that mission statement. And what we saw in our research and what we heard in conversations with board members is that in a lot of cases, there's a disconnect, in part because the board is empowering executive leadership to carry out the mission. So the board is, again, approving sort of top level, like the budget, but they're not looking at what is the carpenter make on a show. And especially in the theaters that reissued budget statements post 2020, which largely focused on things like Black Lives Matter and accessibility and equity, inclusion, and diversity. How do those things relate to each other? If you're in a position to be donating money, can you earmark that money for humans? Instead of saying, will you name a staircase after me? Can you instead say, I want 100% of my donation to go to increasing artist fees or increasing production labor? Not everybody's going to be in a position to do that, but it's potentially a way to make change.
Yeah, and giving money or donating money or allocating money, you at least have a fighting chance to say, this is where I want my money to go. So if anybody has any leverage, it would be somebody giving money. All right, so what I'm hearing from that, though, is actually some actionable things for institutions that institutions can do, which is focus on the workers, trying to earmark the funds for people pay, or at least get that in the zeitgeist of our energy. And then institutional funding, the same thing, trying to get that going toward labor. Now, with the grant requirements, is that something you found that the grants are restricting it, or as grants are stipulated nowadays, is there a way that an organization could still get the grant and earmark money for labor?
This is not necessarily based on the research that Natalie and I did. It's conversations we've then been having since then where this is coming from. So this isn't from any of our sort of survey data or anything, but I mean, just from personal experience of working in organizations and being a part of grant applications, experience has been that decisions are made based on criteria foundations have. For example, we do a project each year that fits into this criteria. This foundation will always support, will fund a musical that touches on these topics. Therefore, the organization bases its priorities off of that. We're going to choose to put our efforts into a musical based on these themes because we know we can get the funding for that. So I don't know that there is a lot of funding opportunities where the criteria is we're funding childcare for all the designers on these projects, things like that. And I think, but to your question of what can employers do, even besides the grant question, it's those kinds of what are the radical ways we can think about our resources, about childcare, about other things. And just to say, I felt like from something you said a moment ago, we focused a lot on pay in this conversation, which is a massive issue. And beyond that, there are many other things the employers can change. And in our book, we really try to trace the employee life cycle being very different as a gig worker than as a person who works for a single employer for your entire career or for even a single year. So we try to really think about from hiring to onboarding to performance measurement and management and how employees are sort of treated and what are reporting ways of reporting and things like that. And there's a lot the employers can do in terms of thinking about the worker experience as well as the pay.
To that point, some of the things that Bree is referencing increase employee retention, which to go back to the production on deck survey, right? If one of the things we hear from employers is that they can't find the workers to do the work. So they're not hiring enough people because they can't find them. And one of the reasons they can't find them is because people leave a field, which is harming them. And so if we can find ways to harm people less, which includes things like employers investing in their employees, right? So it's about setting up a system where there are clear goals, clear measurement of those goals, clear ways to give feedback and access additional training, where workers know who their supervisors are, a thing that many people do not.
Offering training on being a supervisor. I think those kinds of things, there's so many people in our field who get having people report to them, but actually have no training on how to do that. And that's something employers could provide. But all of this gets to this idea of shared resources, because the sort of belief is that that's not the employer's responsibility, because they're not just their employees, usually. Thinking about your previous episode about the shared scenic resource in Philly and the shared studio space, it's like, how does that function in terms of these trainings? Are there ways that organizations could come together and offer, what are the sort of radical ways of thinking about these ways to support the workers in a way, but not placing all of the financial responsibility on a single institution?
Yeah, and we look at models like, there was an example in Pittsburgh of several not-for-profit institutions who shared an HR person, human, because none of them were able to have full-time HR support. And though we could have a whole different conversation about our feelings about HR, workers deserve some kind of support. And I think theaters are good at sharing stuff. Like in my experience as a production manager, it was always very easy to write to another production manager and say, hey, we're looking for some curtains. Do you have extra Marley? Can I borrow 3 source 4 barrels? But we're not as good at sharing human resources, the resources of people. And so how can we increase that? And then to Bree's point, increase the employer investment in those humans, so that you're not just thinking about your labor as disposable and therefore replaceable.
All right, so we're running out of time here. So if you want to look at any of the questions we had left, I'm just going to pick a couple. But if there's any that you really wanted to answer, let me know. So I'm going to combine 2 and hopefully you can do it. What is the message that you're wanting to send to theaters with this book and this research? And then also, how can either those workers or listeners that are hearing this, what can they do to support, better working conditions or better things?
A message that we want to send is that professional theater art is work. And because we are making art, that does not equate to not working. And there's just this really deep belief and idea that because what we do is creative, we don't need pay, but also these systems that support people at a sort of scalable level, but we do.
Right. So art is work. Artists are workers. I think also that what we know from our research and from living in the field is that workers can make change at the immediate level by coming together and asking for change to happen, whether that is formal unionizing or just a group of workers coming and demanding that the employers make change. Those work in both ways. The theaters have listened. They haven't necessarily succeeded in making the changes, but even the theaters that are saying well, look, we've checked off this thing, have listened to the demands that people have made of them. So the continual demanding works. One of the messages we want to give to theaters is listen to your workers, ask them what they need. Think about the people making the art. To Bree's previous point about theaters making the thing that grants will fund, I think one of the things we really see that is in the emphasis that theater organizations put on their education departments, because there's always arts education funding available. And in some cases, what we've heard from workers is that the art that the theater is making has been subjugated to the educational programming. the institutions need to go back to their mission and figure out like, what is the thing we're here to do? And how do we best support the people who are doing that work?
Mm-hmm. And just one other thing on that list of things that institutions can do, I think, is to not be proprietary about these ideas about how to make the change. We can potentially own the piece that we're creating, but I don't think that we should have any privacy or ownership over these radical ways of trying things. And if we could find ways to be more collaborative, both amongst workers, but also amongst employers and institutions, we could potentially make progress in a less harmful way.
And when you say that, is it saying like if a theater is going to try something, like we're trying this, be public about that?
Public in some way at some point, like even if it's working groups or, it doesn't like the public always makes me think like in the news, maybe not that, but maybe, like during COVID, there was all this talk and that hasn't all continued. But even if it's just roundtables about the things that we're trying or, I think just dialogue.
Yeah, we know that there are a lot of groups of employers who came together during COVID to try to figure out how to solve the institutional level problems that they were having. We hope those groups have continued. We don't know. But this, right, to Bree's point, like they can talk about those things. And also, I think everybody doesn't have to invent the wheel from scratch every time. Like if you have made a change and it has worked or not, tell your colleagues about what your challenges were so that they don't have to like make the same change and learn the same thing.
And that also, I think, relates to transparency between people in management positions and workers.
Okay, that's awesome. And also, I love what you said about asking for change. We all work so much, we're tired, blah, 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 blah. I don't have time to advocate for myself. But that being said, you have to. And asking for what you want, even if you're not going to get it, is helpful. Because I find myself doing that sometimes, is asking for a higher fee and putting in all this extra time and effort. And part of it is for me, yes, I want a higher fee. But also I'm thinking, well, no one else is going to be doing this. So I have to be that stick in the mud or maybe even burn the bridge, which I don't really do, but potentially put myself out there too. It takes time and energy, but ask for it, because if you're sitting there in silence, nothing is going to happen. But if you at least just send the email, maybe at 3 a.m. when you're really frustrated, just send it off. Just do it. You won't regret it. I've never regretted it. Okay, one time maybe, but if you don't say anything, nothing's happening.
And even if nothing happens in that instance, maybe in 5 years, you and 5 other people who sent that same email will come to, like you never know what having some documentation and some action could lead to.
All right. So as we wrap up here, where can people connect with you and or who do you want to be connecting with you?
We want anyone who wants to talk to us. Our book website is productionlaborbook.com, in which there's contact information for us as well as links to buy the book in both physical and ebook form. So we encourage folks to do that. We also have an Instagram, which is at theater.work.book, theater RE. And we encourage folks to follow us. We're sharing various data from the book and from our research not included in the book there, and are excited to be engaging with folks in that way. We want the book to get into the hands of workers because we find that they feel affirmed in that their experiences are not, that they are not alone in their experiences, but that their experiences are shared by other workers. And we want the book to get into the hands of folks who have the power to make change. So we encourage you to buy a copy of the book and give it to your local artistic director, or loan it to them, or request your library carry it, things like that. We're also excited to talk to educators who are interested in either using the book in their classrooms or in inviting us to come and do workshops or conversations with their students about this kind of work.
If we had some big mystery benefactor, something that they could do would be to send a copy of the book to every theater institution in the US. That would be that's a dream of ours. No, but as Natalie said, on our website, there's a way for folks who might be interested in reviewing the book to request a copy for review. Any teachers who might be interested in using it can request an inspection copy. And we really, really encourage anyone listening to request it at their local library.
Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to request it at the library. Yeah. Okay, and also what I'm hearing is I should buy 10 copies, and then every show I do, just leave it in the break room, or if I can find out where the offices are, or just backstage, or even at a tech table that has to get cleaned up at some point. So what's this book doing here?
That's a great idea. Also, if you have a copy, if I can just say, we love photos of copies of the book at work. So if somebody has a copy, you should send us a photo of it in the theater because we love this.
Amazing. Awesome. Okay. And tag you on the Instagram.
Hashtag theater work at work.
Hashtag theater work at work. All right. Okay. So before we go, let me encourage everybody listening to check out both of your long form bios, which I'm going to put on the show page. There'll be a link to it in the show notes, because you are both very accomplished and experienced and have a lot of passions and activities that are tangential to theater that we didn't obviously cover here because we didn't talk about you specifically. Notably, Natalie, I saw that you're producing festivals, or you have done that, which I think is impressive to me. And then Bree, you've done craft workshops, and then of course all your what I'll call political stuff, like not theater, political stuff. So anyway, but your bios are very impressive, and so if anybody wants just a quick read, go over to the show notes and read that. Yeah, that's it. That's everything. Thank you so much for a great conversation. This could go for another 4 more hours. And I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for giving us the time and all this knowledge. So thank you. That's it for this week's episode. My takeaways are: there were actionable ideas for institutions. People working at the institution can focus on paying for labor over things. Individuals who visit the institution can hold the institution accountable for their mission statement and emphasize thriving wages for workers more than new works, new facilities, or new things. In today's discussion, we didn't focus on the mental health, equity, or accessibility aspects of theatrical labor. Those are intertwined in this topic and wildly important, but we need whole other discussions for those. They are covered in Natalie and Bree's book. Related to that, something Natalie said really stuck with me. People leave a field that is harming them. I can't articulate why that sticks with me, but emotionally it has lodged itself into my brain. People leave a field that is harming them. Another thought I had when prepping for this episode and asking myself, why is this discussion needed and why now? So these conversations are important because we need a national group think or a rethink on theater working conditions. It has to be groupthink because we need a critical mass of people thinking this way so that we can modify systems to allow theater workers to expect the same protections as other workers. Things that are as basic as minimum wage, holiday pay, parental leave, and other benefits that are expectations for 9-to-5 workers, but slip through the cracks for theater workers. Of course, this is why unions exist, but not all theater workers are in unions. Now, without groupthink, any individual change that we do is only impactful to those directly connected to our work. Is it important? Yes, but we need enough people doing that work so that it becomes an expectation that is scalable up to the institution level and then up to the city, the state, and the national level. I'll end by reiterating the overarching actionable item that you can keep in your brain. If you're working in an institution at the managerial level or decision-making level, obviously you've heard this conversation or similar conversations 1,000 times. But if you're listening to this, you are clearly interested in improving conditions where you're at. So what you can take away from this conversation is the directive to focus on people and laborers over stuff. This is the conversation to continually put forward. Those were my takeaways. Thank you for sitting with us for this serious topic. I try to keep it light and fun here because that's what makes life enjoyable. But these topics need focused on, or they continue to get swept under the rug. To end on a silly note, the dad joke to end the episode: why is it that the people in the sound department are always so healthy? Because they have good gut bacteria and microbes. That's it for today. Until next time, break a leg.
Thank you for listening to Artistic Finance, where we interview successful artists, leaders, and investors to help educate and inspire the creative community. To access our show notes and resources, go to artisticfinance.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Artistic Finance. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.